Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the live stream. Here we are. It is another beautiful day in Southern California, 72 and sunny. Pretty typical. I hope it's beautiful weather wherever you are. Maybe a little more fall-like so you can really enjoy a pumpkin spice latte or a hot chocolate. But anyway, can't really control the weather. So today we're going to be continuing on with our third and final uh, live stream on semantic HTML. We are calling it POSH for plain old semantic HTML. And today we're doing the last 2 units of the class, which do get a little bit more advanced, especially Unit 6. But it's just JavaScript. Don't worry, it won't bite you. It'll be fine. So if you haven't been here before and aren't familiar with the website where all the course materials are, I have it up on the screen here. It is at poshfoundations.tech. You can go there if you want to follow along. You can get links to all of the exercises, links out to all of the solutions that I have posted, and access the slides at your own pace. Try them out. So quick tour through the website for those of you who haven't seen it before. It will automatically detect if you have a preference for light or dark backgrounds. Of course, mine is set to dark, but you could switch it to a light background if you prefer. So you have total control over it. If you leave it at auto, it'll be whatever your system settings are. I know sometimes people have time-based settings where it's light mode during the day, but then it switches to dark mode at night. So if you want to leave it on auto, that's perfectly fine too. And then rather than trying to wrestle around and try to figure out what accent color is the most accessible, what might people like the most, everybody's different. Everybody has their own preferences. So you have all of these choices. So choose your favorite color. And I think because it is October and it is fall, I'm going to go with pumpkin today. So that we have a nice fall color scheme. It will remember your color scheme as you switch between pages. So that works just fine. And then once you have selected a unit from the side over here, and we're going to start today with Unit 5. Oops, AI is trying to jump in there all the time, isn't it? You can click this hide menu to give more space for the slides. And let me just hide that out of the way too. And then that way the slides will fill your whole screen. And it is set up that you can use these buttons here, your back, next, and top buttons to kind of navigate through the slides that are available on each in each unit. So I think that about wraps it up. That site, once again, is poshfoundations.tech. If you want to go there and follow along on your own, copy paste out code examples, etc., it is available, 24/7 like any other website. So if you want to come back to it later and try out the exercises, it is there available for you. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with Unit 5, which is semantic HTML elements that you may not know. And let's get started with dialogs. So that is something that comes up all the time, and we are specifically talking about modal dialogs. And modal dialog means that it is blocking access to the rest of the page. So once that dialog has opened, I cannot scroll the page behind it. I cannot click links behind it. I can't get to them with my mouse, which means I also shouldn't be able to get to them with my keyboard, which is a common thing that goes wrong. So let's talk about how a modal dialog should ideally work. All right, so first, when the modal opens, focus should be moved to the modal. Now, exactly where in the modal, you can find all kinds of interesting articles online that will give you all different ideas. Maybe it should be moved to the close button. Maybe it should be moved to the main heading. Maybe it should be moved to the first focusable element in the modal, which is probably going to be the close button. For me, it depends on exactly the purpose of the modal. Like I can't say like, here's the rule you should always follow. So definitely look into some of the, do some web research, look around, get some advice on exactly which element in the modal you should have focus when it opens, and implement that in your app. And of course, the best thing to do is always to do user testing with your own users, because your audience might be slightly different than what everybody else's audience prefers. So the best thing to do is user testing with your own users. But we're going to put focus in the modal once it opens. While the modal is open, focus should be trapped in the modal. So I shouldn't be able to tab, or shift tab, and get out of the modal. This is a very common mistake that happens. So definitely test your modals and make sure that you can't tab out of them and get to something else on the page. Now, you should be able to tab to the browser Chrome, right? You should be able to get to the address bar and buttons and things that are in your browser. I apologize. There's a helicopter or something else. That should be gone in a second. You should be able to get to browser Chrome, but you shouldn't be able to access anything on the web page itself outside of the modal. Okay, when the modal closes, focus should go back to whatever triggered it to open. So if I opened a modal by clicking on a button, when I close that modal, focus should go back to that button. That is another very common mistake that happens, is that focus doesn't get managed there. And what happens if you don't explicitly move focus back to something on the page, it just goes back to the top. And so a user using keyboard only or a screen reader has to tap back to where they were. And it is extremely frustrating, as you can imagine. All right, I have a question from Alan. Is there any content to avoid putting in a modal, such as a form? Not as a hard and fast rule, no. You just want to be thoughtful about, does that experience make the most sense? As long as all of your focus and everything is handled correctly, there isn't any content that I would say never put that in a modal. Again, it's always going to depend on your use case and how well user testing goes with your particular users. So forms and modals, I kind of feel like people are pretty used to that at this point. It's not going to surprise anyone. And as long as the form is all coded up to be accessible and the modal itself is all coded up to be accessible, there shouldn't be any problems caused by that. All right. Another thing that gets missed all the time, when we hit the escape key, it should close the modal. I try this all the time. I just try it on random websites all the time. Escape, did it close? No. Most of the time the answer is no. So please make sure that when you hit the escape key, it closes the modal. And then, of course, I shouldn't be able to tab to modal content when the modal isn't open, which is not super common, not as common as some of the other issues that I've already covered, but it does happen where that modal is maybe just being positioned off the screen with CSS, right? Like being absolutely positioned out of the viewport, but the content is still there. And so I can still access it with the keyboard or with a screen reader as though it were still visible. So make sure that you can't do that you cannot get to your modal. It should also have a clear and descriptive title so that when it opens, I understand exactly what this modal is all about, why it opened, what's in it, why it exists. And then, of course, we should have a visible and clear close button. Yes, hitting the escape key should close it, but I should also have a very clear way to get to a close button with my mouse or with my keyboard or with a screen reader, right? I should be able to get to a close button to close it out. All right, so Candace says, I think it depends on if the metadata between browsers, the online content itself, and/or adaptive technology are compatible with one another. They each read code a little bit differently. Yeah, that is always the case. It is frustratingly always the case, which is why it's always important to test with your own users, because your particular audience might tend toward using certain types of technology or certain browsers, and you want to make sure that it's working for your particular audience always. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So can you code all of that functionality that I just said on your own, just using a div for your modal? Absolutely, yes, you could. But chances are you're going to forget something. And also, that's a lot of work managing all that focus and making sure the escape key works, like all that functionality, right? That's pretty difficult. And chances are you're going to forget something, which is why so many of those issues, like I mentioned, are really common across the web. So we do have a native dialog element, which can be used to create either modal or non-modal dialogs. So it does have a modal mode, I guess, that you can put it into. You don't need any kind of ARIA role. It automatically includes all of that focus management for you. So it'll move focus to the dialog when it's open. It'll move it back to whatever triggered it when it closes. It also locks you out from interacting with other parts of the page when it is in the modal mode. And it has a little API that you can use in JavaScript if you want to open or close it with JavaScript. All the modern browsers fully support it, and it is, of course, semantic HTML friendly. So here's a sample of what that would look like. So we have our dialog with an ID because we may want to refer to it with JavaScript or with CSS, either one. So we have an ID. We're saying ARIA labeled by, and you can see that it is labeled by the settings heading, which is my first heading that is inside of the dialog. So we're pointing to that specifically as a heading for the dialog. I have whatever my content is that's inside of my dialog, right? It's going to happen here. And then I've got a button that's on the page. This is outside the dialog, right? This is the button that would open my modal. So this is how we would use that simple JavaScript API to open that modal by just saying on click, we'll get the element and say show modal. So it is pretty straightforward to use and is going to work so much better for you than trying to cover all of that functionality by just using a div. All right, and I have an example here. Here is my modal. You can, of course, so this little slide presentation that I have together on this HTML site is using a CSS library. I forget exactly which one it is at this point, but this is how that library is styled. A modal, you have complete control with CSS. If you don't like the way this looks, you want modals to look different in your application or your website, that's fine. You can style them with CSS. Everything can work. So you see, I can hit the escape key and close the modal and focus returned back to the button. So if I say, oh, wait a second, I want to reopen the modal, super easy. Focus is already there. I can hit enter or the space key. I can open the dialog and you can see that focus is currently on that close button. So if I hit the space key, it's going to close the modal. And now you can see with the focus ring there, the focus is back on the button that opened the modal. All right, next element that you may not know about is our progress element. So if you need to communicate some kind of progress to a user, they're working their way through multiple pages of a form or they're completing some kind of task and you want to show progress toward completing that task, you don't have to cobble together a div with ARIA live regions or anything like that. You can use the progress element. It gets a label, just like it was as though it were a form field. And there is no minimum attribute because the min is always 0 with the progress element, but you can set the current value and you can do that programmatically. So if you want to update the current value with JavaScript, you can absolutely do that. You can set a max value. 100 is a nice, if you're just doing percentages, having the max is 100 is really nice. You probably want to assign it an ID so that you can easily associate a label with it and or easily get to it with JavaScript. And then you can put whatever text you would like inside of it. And this is an example right here, this uploading image with the bar that shows about 70%. That's what it looks like in this particular CSS library that I was using. But again, it is completely styleable with CSS. So if you want it to look like something else, you can definitely do that. You can adjust it and make it look however you would like, whatever colors you would like, add borders, add backgrounds, add, make it taller, make it shorter, whatever you would like to do. All right, now similar element, but slightly different is our meter element, which is just going to give us a snapshot value of where something is right now. So like your battery, for example. How full is my battery, right? We're not tracking progress through a task. We're just saying a snapshot of here we are within a range or here we are within some kind of fractional value. So a battery is a good example that I think most people can understand. The markup for it is very similar to the progress element, but we use meter, obviously, as the tag name instead of progress. And here we do have a min attribute that we can set. So it depends on what you're doing. You can set a min and a max, and you can do some other fun things as well. So in the first example, we just have battery. We have a min, max, and the current value. And in this current CSS library that I use, that's what that looks like. All customizable with CSS. If you don't like how that looks, you can make it look different and style it however you would like. And it's very similar, just like a form field, it gets a label and it can give us a snapshot of where our current value is. Now down here, you can see that I added another attribute for low equal to 20 so that my I'll get another CSS property that I can style that if I want to show a warning on the battery. So if it's below 20, it's going to get this alternate style. And you can see that this one shows up yellow as that one shows up green. So it conveys some extra information, but that same information is available programmatically. So we're not relying on just the visual display of that information. So we actually have programmatic information that's telling me, hey, my battery is low. I might need to find an outlet soon and charge this battery up because my bar turned yellow, or I'm getting some information that I'm below the low threshold on there. Oh, I guess that's the end of of this unit. All right. So some POSH HTML elements that you may not have heard of or may not have used before. There are lots of others as well. I might add another couple slides to this unit a little bit later because I think sometimes people don't realize that there are more types of form fields than just like text, input type text, selects, checkboxes, and radio buttons, right? We actually have date selectors built in, semantic HTML. We have range sliders. We have all kinds of different form fields, special form fields for entering phone numbers, for entering numbers that work really well, especially with a soft keyboard on a mobile device, because it'll bring up a slightly different keyboard. That can be really helpful for filling something in, or a very different keyboard. If you have a number, it just opens the number pad that looks like a number pad on a phone. And then you don't have to try to press those teeny tiny numbers that are along the top of the regular keyboard when you just want to enter numbers. So if you need to build if you think you need to build some kind of custom form element to handle things like dates, ranges, etc., definitely take a look at what types of inputs are actually available in HTML, because there are some very nice ones available that will take care of a lot of the functionality and a lot of the accessibility for you when they are implemented correctly. All right, let's move along then to Unit 6, where we're going to be looking at POSH in modern frameworks. So if you are building single page apps and using, React or Vue or one of the other JavaScript framework libraries that are out there and available. Um, these are some of the worst offenders for not including semantic HTML in their code. And it is entirely the fault of, I think, the tutorials that tend to get published online show very bad habits. A lot of, on-click handlers added to divs instead of using buttons and things like that. So you do have to give some careful thought to semantic HTML when you are using those frameworks, because yes, you're writing JSX or whatever, but that is ultimately rendering as HTML in the browser. And you need to still make sure that it is semantic HTML that is still correct. And Alan says that input type tell is very helpful on mobile devices. It is so helpful when you have to enter a phone number on a mobile device and you get nice big number buttons that you can press instead of those teeny tiny ones. And you can enter your phone number like so much faster, at least twice as fast, maybe even 3 times as fast. It's so much easier. So definitely give some thought to those. If you're collecting an email address, you get a very nice little keyboard. If you use an input type of email, you get a very nice little one that has the .com button and the @ symbol already there for you. You don't have to go, navigate to alternate views of the keyboard to try to get to those characters and things. And it makes it a lot easier and faster. All right, so we're going to be talking about React and Vue and all of its friends and cousins. You can't skip semantics. Semantics are still important, even if you're building a super modern, absolutely amazing app. The basics still apply. The foundation still applies. That is still getting sent to the browser as HTML, and you still have to give some thought to what markup you are using and what markup you are generating. JSX practically encourages you to use just divs for everything. So please take a moment, step back, and think about, like, should this actually be a div? Or do I need a heading? Do I need a form label? Do I need a button? Do I need a link? Do I need a different type of form input? What should this element actually be? Because probably it's not a div, especially if it's something that your users are going to interact with. And it's not a technical limitation. Like, I want to be clear about that. It's not a technical limitation of Vue or React or anything else. It is just it's a cultural problem with these modern frameworks. And a lot of the component libraries and things like that, NPM packages and things like that you're going to use in your project, check them for accessibility, check them for semantic code, because so many of them are not using it. And you don't want to build your entire app on a foundation that's not using semantic code and isn't accessible, because it's going to be next to impossible for you to remediate that later. You want to have that in mind from the very beginning. When you're evaluating a component library, you should be looking at, what kind of code is this outputting to the browser? Is it semantic HTML, or is it just div soup? Right, so we want to be careful and intentional, and behave just the same way that we would if we were just writing plain old HTML, right? We want to really give some thought to, how would we mark these things up? And if you go back to, there's videos on both LinkedIn and YouTube of the first 4 units of this POSH Foundations class. If you want to go back and take a look at some of those to get an idea of how you would look at a design and figure out, how would I mark that up in a semantic way? So we covered that in some of the earlier units. So some patterns that you want to keep an eye out for is components that don't have any kind of structure. So some kind of custom interactive component, or just custom information component that's just divs, just divs all the way down. That's definitely a red flag. There should probably be some kind of semantic structure in there somewhere. So keep an eye out for that. Accessibility afterthoughts. So trying to kind of shoehorn in ARIA attributes and weird workarounds because things weren't meant built to be accessible from the beginning. So be on the lookout for those kinds of things. Getting links and buttons backward, right? So having something that should be a link marked up as a button and vice versa. But I think probably even the bigger problem that we see way more commonly is divs and spans getting treated as though they were links or buttons without having all of the, you can do that. Sorry, I keep interrupting myself. You can do that. You can make a div or a span act as a button, but it takes way more work than you might realize at first. And you're probably going to leave something out. You're probably going to forget, oh, that's right, a button should work with the space bar as well as the enter key, right? You may not realize that if you're not a regular keyboard user. You might not even know that that's an interaction that users are going to expect, and then you leave it out. And then people can't use your div that was coded up as a button. You could just save yourself all the headache and code it as a button to begin with, and you get all of that functionality built into it for free. So Alan asks, is it accurate to say to never use an A with the href attribute set to pound? That is definitely a red flag when I'm doing a code review. If I see an href equal to the pound sign or an href with JavaScript in it, that's definitely a red flag. A div or a span with an on-click, handler on it is also definitely a red flag and something that you need to take a closer look at. And make sure that everything got coded up correctly. So quick review on that. Links should take you somewhere else, whether that is a different place on the current page to a new page. And since we're talking about modern JavaScript frameworks, they're taking you to a different component or a different route, a different view of some kind. So if that's what's happening when you click it, it should be a link. If it's doing anything else, if it's submitting a form, opening or closing a drop-down menu, opening or closing a modal, then it should be a button tag. All right, so one of the best things, but also the worst things about these modern JavaScript frameworks is that they have lots of reusable components, which is great when you build your reusable component to use semantic HTML and to be accessible, and then you can multiply that across your app for very little extra work. But if you make a mistake in your component and you forget to use a button tag and you use a div, or you forget to use headings for sections of content, then you are multiplying those accessibility issues across your app. So it can be, like the slide says, your best friend or your worst enemy. So be really, really careful when you are building reusable code, because you are potentially multiplying problems across your app. And that doesn't apply just to accessibility issues, right? That applies to performance issues and design issues and all sorts of other things that you might be multiplying across your app when you're creating those reusable components. Do extra work when you're creating a reusable component, especially one that's going to be used everywhere throughout the app, and make sure that it's performant, that it's accessible, that it's marked up correctly, that it's maintainable, that people can understand it when they come back to it later, and all of those kinds of things. All right, so what can you do to help make this situation better? So first, you can add an accessibility linter or checker in your CI pipeline. So at Aardvark, we have that. So we have an accessibility checker that runs every time somebody commits code to a branch, and double checks to make sure that they haven't made any obvious mistakes. Now, that is not going to catch 100% of accessibility issues that people are introducing, because it's essentially the same. It's going to have the same limitations as running an automated accessibility checker. But it is going to catch some really low-hanging fruit and prevent people from having images that don't have alt text, from misusing different types of labels, from having color contrast issues. It's going to be able to catch a lot of those things. So it is definitely worth doing, even though you need to be aware up front. It is not, that's not a fail-safe. You can't just have a checker in your pipeline and say, well, it's done. Our app is accessible because all of our PRs get accepted. No, there's still some work to be done, which it takes me to point number 2, which is running accessibility checks in your browser. So while you're working, you're in your dev environment, coding things up, run some accessibility checks in the browser, both automated and manual. So you should be kind of running through some checks before you're committing that code. You do want to be, let's run a quick automated checker on each screen, and don't forget to run it on each state, right? So if a component's got 3 different states, you want to check each state of that component and run that automated checker on it 3 times for each of those different states. And then do some simple manual checks in your browser. There's some earlier live stream videos where I walk you through the WCAG quick checks, which once you get used to doing those, they take less than 10 minutes. And it helps you to test for just some really common issues with keyboard navigation and screen reader problems and other things like that, just real fast. Get used to doing that before you commit code, and make sure that you're running through those manual checks just to check any places where you may have forgotten something or something that's just not working. And that's my final thing, is test your markup manually. So the automated checks and the manual checks before you commit code can really help make a difference. You're catching issues as you go instead of creating all this tech debt and letting those issues pile up. All right, this is something that gets left out quite a lot because Vue and React and its friends and cousins, right, will let you just throw a form field on a page, an input type text on a page, not wrapped in a form element. But do make an effort to actually wrap form fields in form tags. Now, depending on exactly what your app is, it might make sense to just wrap your whole app in a form tag. It depends on what it is. Other times you might have individual forms within a single page app. So you'll know best what makes the most sense here. But if you have some kind of form element, an input, a select, a text area, any of those, right, and any of the special form elements that we discussed a little bit earlier, if you have those on the page, they should be inside of a form tag. And you can, prevent that form from being submitted unless somebody explicitly clicks the submit button, so that somebody hits enter in an input or something like that. It's not going to submit. So you have control over it and how it works. But what that does is it allows assistive technology to trigger forms mode to make it easier for people using assistive technology to actually interact with your form. So you do want to be thoughtful about that and make sure that you are using form tags within your application. And then, yes, it's JSX and it feels like the wild, wild west and like all rules are removed, but treat it just like HTML, right? You have to make sure all of your form fields have labels, the exact same markup as we talked about a couple of units ago when we talked about forms. So they can have explicit or implicit labels. They can use ARIA labeled by. There's all these different ways of doing it, but make sure that your form fields have labels and they should be visible at all times. Placeholders don't count. If you have sets of radio buttons or sets of checkboxes, especially, make sure that you are wrapping those in field sets with legends. If you have form fields that go together, like you're collecting somebody's address and you have, the street address, city, state, or province, or region, or whatever it happens to be, and then some kind of a postal code, for example, that makes sense to wrap those in a field set with a legend that says address, right, or billing address or shipping address or whatever happens to be appropriate. Make sure that you're using buttons and links correctly. So we've talked about that quite a lot. Make sure that you're not putting click handlers or other kinds of interactive handlers on divs and spans. If you find yourself doing that, that's a clue that maybe you should be using a button or maybe a link, depending on what you're doing. And of course, make sure that anytime you have icons or images or any kind of graphics, that you are including alternative text for the people who can't see those images for whatever reason. So same, all the same rules, nothing new. Everything, still got to follow all the rules, even though it feels like it's a different world. All right, so here's our example of an accessible button in React. So I have a reusable component here of a save button. And if you haven't used React or Vue or something before, don't be intimidated. It's just JavaScript. It won't bite you. But know that this is the way it looks. It does look a little bit different than code that you might be used to. But I think you could probably still recognize that we have some HTML here writing out a button with some text in the middle that says save, and we remember to say type button so that this button won't submit the form. So that gets compiled, right? JSX gets piled into an actual button on the page instead of a div with an on-click handler. All right, so Alan has a question. Is this method for checkboxes and radios still accessible? I'm not sure what method you mean, Alan. I'm sorry. Can you clarify? Do you mean to do implicit or labels maybe for those? Oh, so I can only see your comment. I wonder if you're posting some code or something that maybe isn't coming through to my platform. Oh, there we go. Okay. Type radio, name foo. I got one line of code with with a radio input. But there is a website from Hayden Pickering called Inclusive Components. You should be able to do a web search for that and turn that up. And he has done some pretty extensive research into how to do things like custom radio buttons, custom checkboxes, custom carousels, custom accordions, like all the really common patterns and what the HTML markup should look like for those. I would definitely take a look there. And maybe after I'm not streaming anymore, I'll be able to see. I have a feeling that you're putting more text in your comment than I'm actually seeing on my side, but maybe after I'm done streaming, I can take a look on LinkedIn itself and see what's happening over there. All right. So in Vue, this is how an accessible link would look. So again, it can look a little bit intimidating if you're not used to using Vue and React. But I think you should be able to recognize at the end of the day that there's some HTML here. So we do use these template tags in Vue for collecting up things that should go together. Sometimes those render to the front end as divs, but then there's another way to use them that they don't render to the front end at all, and they're just kind of for organizing your code. But you can see that I have a regular old href in here that's going somewhere, going to a link, and I can go to learn more. And then that's what the rest of my component would look like, just exporting this component basically. If I'm using router, you can actually use this router link as your tag name. And that will render to the front end as a link. So Vue processes that correctly and will make that a link tag, an actual A tag, after that's rendered and sent to the browser. So it will be correct. And this is a nice shortcut if you're using Vue Router. This is a nice shortcut for creating links. It helps to keep your code a little bit neater, and you can kind of see, it makes it easier to see the places where you are linking within your own app to different components and different views, versus when you're linking outside of your app, you wouldn't be able to necessarily do that. You would want to just use a regular A with an href attribute. All right, toggle button for React. So this one gets a little bit complicated, but we can kind of take a look at some of the more important parts of it. So we're basically, the interaction that I have here is a menu toggle, right? So probably some kind of hamburger icon, right? Or maybe the word menu. that when I click it, it's going to open a menu, and I click it again and it would close the menu. So let's look at some of the important parts of this code that we're making sure that we're sending through to the front end. So this little thing here looks really weird and crazy, but it's basically because when you're returning a React component, you have to have a root element because of how JSX works. So that's just an empty root element there. Then we have a button tag, not a div, but we're actually using a button, and it has a type of button. And we have our ARIA expanded attribute here, and that is set to expanded, and our code is going to toggle that value to either true or false to say whether or not my menu is open right now. I also have the ARIA controls attribute, which is set to menu, and you can see down here I have a nav with an ID of menu. So programmatically now I have tied the button together with this nav element, and assistive technology can understand that that button controls that menu, that those two things programmatically go together. And then I'm running a little JavaScript on the click event of the button. And because it is a regular button tag, that onClick handler is automatically going to handle keyboard interactions as well. If this was a div, I would have to add additional keyboard handlers, listening for key presses, and then is it the enter key, is it the space bar, etc. I would have to do all of that myself. But because I'm using a button tag, I can just use onClick, and that's automatically, I'm going to get my keyboard accessibility for free. Basically, I don't have to do any work to get it. And I have the word menu, in this case, within my button. And then this is going to conditionally render the menu if expanded is set to true. And I have an ARIA label of main navigation on my nav. If you have more than one nav, if you remember from our unit that we did on landmarks, if you have more than one nav landmark on a page, which I feel like most pages these days do, they each need to have an accessible name so that a user can tell them apart. So here we have an ARIA label on this of main navigation and my ID. And then within my nav, as usual, I'm using an unordered list of links, essentially, to build this navigation menu. So all the same things that you would do if you were literally just opening, index.html in a code editor and manually editing your HTML, all the same things apply. There's a few little things like this in here because it is React. But the HTML itself doesn't change. It's the exact same. All right, and then we have Svelte, and full disclosure, I have never used Svelte. So I picked up this example online, but I did want to kind of just walk through it because it shows kind of the same principles. And sorry, my kitty cat here wants to be part of the stream. He likes being internet famous. This is Ollie. All right, Ollie. All right, so you can see that we have a form, and we have some handlers for submit on it, and we're also trimming email. And here we've got a form field for collecting email addresses, and you notice that it says type equals email. So not a type equals text, but an actual type equals email. And then we have a label tag that is correctly associated with my form field. So these are programmatically tied together. And down here we have a help message that says we'll never share your email address. And we are correctly associating that with our form field because we are using this ARIA described by attribute to tie this email help ID to my form field. If you forget to do that, then when assistive technology users are in forms mode, they will never hear your paragraph because paragraphs get skipped. Non-form control elements get skipped entirely in forms mode. So if you forget to use this ARIA describe by to associate this paragraph with your input, some of your users aren't going to hear that helpful little instruction. So make sure that you do that. And ARIA described by, we can pass a whole array of IDs to that. And so here we have a conditional where if there is an error, we're also going to have the email error. So it is a space-separated list of IDs. And as far as I know, there's no technical limit on how many you can have. Probably for code maintainability, don't get carried away. But here we are. So you can see that conditionally, this little error is going to show up like if we forgot to fill out our email field to say email is required. And here, this is just conditional. Oops, this is just conditional code that is showing that email error in the ARIA described by property if there's an error. So now this error message is also correctly associated with our form field programmatically, so all of the users will hear it. So keep an eye on, there is a new ARIA attribute that is specifically for error messages. It doesn't have great browser support just yet. But for now, we're still using ARIA described by, but there is a new ARIA error message, I believe it's called, that hopefully soon we'll be using specifically for error messages on form fields. And then we have our submit button, a button of type submit at the bottom. So all of the HTML should be recognizable, even if you don't know Svelte, if you don't know JavaScript at all. The HTML that's here should still be recognizable, and it's all semantic and it's all accessible as well. All right, a modal in React. So here's how we would mark that up. So we're creating a reusable component for our modal dialog. And we want to keep track if it's open and run some code if it closes. And you can see that our HTML markup that we're sending to the browser is the dialog. And that is our ref for our code, our interactive code in React. We're running some code on close. And we have our ARIA labeled by the modal title, which is the H2 that's inside the modal. Tells us what the modal is all about, so we understand it. And again, we have some content. We have our form with a close button. So all semantic code, all marked up. Focus is going to be handled for us. It's going to be moved to the modal when it opens. It's going to be moved back to where it was when the modal closes. It's going to be trapped in the modal while it's opened. So we don't have to manage any of that. We're getting all of that functionality for free because we are using a dialog element instead of a div to create this modal in React. All right, so even when you're using modern JavaScript frameworks, if HTML has a tool for it already, use it. Don't try to rebuild things from scratch. You are almost certainly going to forget some type of interaction that people using assistive technology are depending on to be able to interact with it. So if it already exists, don't waste your time trying to rebuild what's going to ultimately be an inferior version of what already exists. All right, so we have some fun exercises at the end of this unit, and I put a whole bunch because I wanted people to be able to have exercises for whichever framework they were more comfortable in. So if you like React better, just do the React exercises. If you like Vue better, just do the Vue exercises. And I have, for all of these, here's where you start if you want to do the exercise, and then my solution is here at the end. And this last one for React is definitely advanced. So if you want to give that one a try, by all means, go ahead and do it. The other ones are pretty simple and straightforward. So even if you're a beginner in Vue or React, you should be able to work your way through those exercises. But yes, that last one does get a little bit involved. So I'll give you a heads up on that before you give it a try. And as always, like if you want to try out those exercises and share your solution with me. You can leave a comment on LinkedIn on this event in LinkedIn, or a comment on YouTube. It'll get back to me and I'll come and check out your solution, because as always, the solution that I'm proposing, at this link is one possible solution. It is not the only solution. So if your solution looks different than mine, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. There's definitely more than one way to create semantic HTML elements, or to look at a certain design, and there's different ways of marking it up that are semantic, that are all correct. Sometimes one might be better than another. Sometimes it doesn't really matter. So if you want me to take a look at what you've come up with, I'm happy to do that. If you just share the link to where you did your exercise. All right. So the end of Unit 5. Frameworks are not an excuse to not write semantic HTML. You want to make sure that you're using those throughout your interface, and especially, please, in your reusable components. Be thoughtful if you are going to use an NPM package, or if you are going to use some pre-built component library. Test it, make sure that it's using semantic HTML, and that the authors of that framework have put some forethought into accessibility, so that you are not going to be starting off kind of with this huge amount of code debt kind of already, or tech debt already built into your project before you even really got started, because you're inheriting all this tech debt from another library that you're deciding to use. Take a step back and be thoughtful and intentional about the markup that you're using. If you find yourself using div, maybe take a moment, re-examine kind of what you're coding, and make sure that that's what actually makes the most sense. Sometimes you're doing a really complex CSS layout and there's really not another way to accomplish it. But other times you're maybe marking things up as divs that would have a better semantic tag. And then little tiny improvements compound over time and can really make a difference over time. So especially when you're working with reusable components, be really thoughtful about the code that you're using and how that's going to have an impact across your app. So we have about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into my little bonus unit here on kind of implementing POSH across your team. And if you just joined the stream, the website to follow along is poshfoundations.tech. It is available at all times. If you want to come back later, read through some of the slides, refresh your memory about some of the things, or try out some of the exercises. All the units have some exercises that you can try out. And it has some nice little features to help you navigate through the slides. So POSH, or plain old semantic HTML, right? Not just one person's job. So you don't ever want to have a situation where you've got like one police officer on your team who's in charge of making sure everybody's following the rules. Everybody should be participating. There should be a team effort into making sure that components that you're building, products that you're building, are using semantic code and are accessible. And that's going to be way less tech debt that you're accumulating as you're working, and it's going to be way more maintainable, and you're going to be happier long term, I think, with how things are going, if you make a little bit of an effort to make things higher quality from the very beginning. So when you're doing code reviews, you do want to make sure that semantics are part of those code reviews, as well as accessibility. That when more senior levels of the team are reviewing code, that they're checking, hey, did this person use headings correctly? Did they get their lists and tables structured correctly? Did they get links and buttons correct, or did they get them mixed up? Did they try to use divs or spans instead of links or buttons? And is the code that's marking something up the semantic markup that helps to communicate the structure of that information, or is it just a bunch of divs? And then, I have a typo on the slide there. So could this be a section rather than a div, right? You don't want to get too carried away with landmark sections, but you do want to make sure that you do have those called out on a page, that they're, if you have a header that appears across all the different views and components of your app, or across all the different parts of your website. Like, is that marked up as a header? And the same thing with a footer and a sidebar, and your main content area, right, should be marked up with a main. So just making sure, like, did we get all of those semantics in place? And then you want to have some documentation, whatever your design library is or your component library. Make sure that it's documented. Like, how do I use this semantically? What elements should I actually be using? And how is this all set up to work? And we want to make sure that developers who are new to this, because we know that as a developer, you are not trained in how to do things accessibly most of the time, right? Like, most of the time that's not included in your training. And so it's something that you have to pick up later on the job. And the best way to help that happen is to have new team members understand, like, not just, hey, you always need to be using these already described by when you have extra information on a field, but to make sure that they understand why that's the case, because it gets easier to remember when you understand why something is happening or why it's a requirement. And then when you're doing code reviews, of course, start looking for those anti-patterns that we talked about a little bit. So are there missing landmarks? Are there clickable divs? Do we have just tons of nested divs for no particular reason that anybody can discern? Are the headings used out of orders? Are we missing field sets wrapped around sets of checkboxes or radio buttons? So learn to think about what those patterns are that show up really commonly and keep an eye out for them when you're doing those code reviews. And of course, the world isn't perfect and we can't always do everything in the 100% perfect and correct way. So figure out when it makes sense to compromise. And when you do have to compromise, you want to make sure that you document that really clearly so that everybody understands why it was necessary for it to be done. And then, of course, you want to do some extensive testing to make sure that you have covered all of the expected keyboard interactions, all of the possible states, all of the possible roles. You want to very thoroughly check that. And if you want help doing that, it is called, oh darn, I might have to leave a comment on the event later. There is a website. It's just completely flown out of my head, even who did it. So I'll leave a comment. There's a nice website where you can say, like, oh, I'm building a custom dialog, and it will give you the list of here's all the things that you need to make sure it does, right? Like, here's all the keyboard interactions you need to make sure, here's all the screen reader interactions you need to test. So it's really nice. I will find it and leave a comment on both LinkedIn and YouTube with that website because it is super helpful. So you want to make sure that you're using something like that to make sure that you're not leaving anything out in the case where you had to build something custom. So the exercise at the end of this unit is you're doing a code review and take a look at it. What issues can you spot? Would you pass that pull request or would you send it back for revisions? So you could give that a try rather. All right. So implementing this across the team, make sure that it's done in the spirit of a shared responsibility, like I said, and not having one person who's the, mean cop on the team who's just always yelling at everybody else. That's never going to work out well and isn't going to be very good for building team rapport. I guess I have a meeting coming up right after this. Okay. Little improvements add up, right? They multiply, they compound. So look for every opportunity, especially when you are working in a reusable component. Take every opportunity that you have to make an improvement for semantics and for accessibility, and get that embedded into the team mindset so that you can have better, more maintainable, more performant, and cleaner code overall. And accessibility is not just a checklist, it's a craft, and it's something that you have to practice and hold each other accountable for on a team. So I think we're right about at end time. So I will say thank you so much for joining me today. The website, once again, is poshfoundations.tech, where you will find all 6 units of this course, along with the bonus unit here at the end, which I think is actually unit 7, even though that says 6 on the screen. So I think I have another typo to fix. And all of the exercises and all of the answers. And if you want me to take a look at what you have personally done in response to any of the exercises, just drop me a link on social media and I'll take a look at those. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you're enjoying some lovely fall weather for October. And I hope you have lots of good plans for improving the accessibility of all of your work this fall. Fall is a nice productive season. I feel like for lots of people, we're all trained from a young age that you go back to school and you start getting some really good stuff done. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you 2 weeks from today for our next live stream. Have a wonderful day.